This is what most people think of as Chinese today. But rewind just 100 years and the story looks completely different. Back then, people spoke all kinds of languages. Shanghainese, Cantonese, Fujianese, Minanyu, and all of these were called Chinese. Mandarin? Barely spoken. A tiny minority actually used it. So that begs the question, if for over 99% of China's 5,000-year history, everyone basically spoke different languages, some as different as French and English, how did China get an entire country to speak one language in just 100 years? And more importantly, what did it really cost them? Not just financially, by the way. We'll get deeper into the cost near the end, but first, how did this massive change even start? I won't lie, this journey was complicated. My team and I combed through dozens of books, reports, and archives on Chinese history to help you understand why this seemingly impossible language experiment was an absolutely necessary one. But to understand how they did it, we first have to understand why they had to do it. See, as you mentioned, throughout China's history, China has always spoke a million different languages. But in 1911, when the Qing dynasty collapsed, an empire that ruled for centuries came to an end. The new Republic of China government leaders took one look at the linguistic chaos and thought, this can't work. Because imagine a country where everyone spoke a different language, like Texas, New York, and Massachusetts, each speaking completely different languages. Could the country run? Could laws be enforced? Could trade flow? Keep in mind, there was no automatic translation back then. How would we get President Trump's lovely messages if they weren't in English? Because here's where it gets personal. I'm Cantonese, and let me tell you, we feel anger towards the government taking away our language and making us speak Mandarin. I hate that my language is being marginalized, but even as I look back at history, it was clear that a common language was needed in China, because no one could build a modern nation without one. So unifying the language, it wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. So in the year 1913, the government picked Mandarin as the new national language, or as they called it, 国语, national language. Why? Well, we explain deeper in another video, but that choice wasn't random. Puyi, Chinese last emperor, spoke Mandarin, and his speech gives us a glimpse of what it sounded like at that time.
现在建设新国家就是本着这种的主义。
If you listen, it's very close to today's standard. But on top of the new mission of convincing 1.2 billion people, yeah, that many, to speak an entirely new language, the government at that time had one more challenge. See, China's literacy rate was shockingly low. Less than 20% of the population could read. This meant that people not only couldn't understand the government speaking Mandarin to them, they also couldn't understand if the government wrote it out for them. If you don't understand what President Trump's saying, at least we can understand his tweets, right? Back then, no one could understand him at all. Between 1920 and 1949, the government tried everything. Phonetic scripts like Zhuyin, which is still used in Taiwan, Latin alphabets, and even character simplifications. Yep, for those of you who hate simplified characters, the idea for it actually started even before the Communist Party came into play. But all these attempts to share the language mostly only reached educated elites. At that time, warlords still ruled certain regions of China, and people clung to their dialects and refused to learn something new. Mandarin was a foreign tongue. I don't travel. It's not like I travel at that. Like, keep in mind, at that time, it's not like people were traveling from Guangdong to Beijing. They don't travel, so why should they have to learn it? Imagine this. You've spoken text in English your whole life. Suddenly, the government comes in and says, hey, you must switch to Boston English now. But you're still in Texas. What do you think? Think you're gonna do it? What do you do? Think about it. What happens to a country's culture and identity when its people are forced to abandon their native tongues and learn a new one? We'll revisit that question at the end. But most people, like expect, just shrugged it back and said, all right, cool story, bro. And so Mandarin was selected, but nobody really committed. So Mandarin's rise was slow, painfully slow. In fact, by the late 1930s, literacy in China was still estimated to be less than 20%, more or less unchanged in 20 years. And the estimated spending up to this point, approximately $50 million US. But then the 1940s hit. World War II, the Japanese invasion, Chinese Civil War, chaos everywhere. And obviously during wartime, the priority is not on getting everyone to speak the same language, right? But even during that chaos, actually, literacy campaigns still happened. The nationalists, which means the Republic of China, the existing government, still pursued literacy in the areas they controlled. And the communists, who were basically the enemy of the nationalists, the existing government in the Chinese Civil War, they were slowly creeping in, and they also pursued literacy in the areas that they controlled. The CCP in particular ran mass literacy campaigns in its rural base areas. Winter schools taught people basic reading, often using simplified scripts or phonetic methods. Mao Zedong and CCP educators emphasized that an illiterate population could not be mobilized. And so literacy, through common language, was a revolutionary priority. But going back to it, let's be real, right? No progress was going to be made during the war, and so by 1949, when the communists won the Chinese Civil War, they inherited a Chinese population where only 1 in 5 people could read, with an even smaller percentage of it able to speak standard Mandarin. Want to know something fascinating? Even Mao Zedong, China's new leader, couldn't speak standard Mandarin. I'll be real. Like, without subtitles, this is a challenge to understand. And so despite having a language barrier himself, they launched the biggest language education campaign in history. In 1956, they replaced traditional complex Chinese characters with simplified ones. This was hugely controversial at that time and is still controversial today, but we'll get into this one a bit later. And they also introduced, in what my opinion was their best move, in 1958 they introduced Hanyu Pinyin, which was basically a phonetic alphabet designed to help people learn Mandarin faster. And this was a game changer. It's funny though, because they actually introduced this because their goal was to eventually make characters obsolete and create something similar to Vietnamese. And I'm pretty glad that never happened, because then you would completely lose out on so much Chinese culture. But anyway, schools were rebuilt, teachers retrained, and kids began learning Mandarin with this new system. The results were dramatic. From 1949 to 1964, over 100 million adults learned to read as a result of their Eliminate Illiteracy drive, 扫盲运动. They ran night schools and rural literacy classes, and by the early 60s, literacy had doubled to about 50%, and with it came more and more fluency in Standard Mandarin. Surveys in the early 50s indicated that only about 41% of Chinese could understand Standard Mandarin, and even fewer could speak. But each new cohort of students increased that number. The late 1950s also saw teacher training programs require Mandarin ability. Normal colleges retrained teachers to speak Putonghua. The groundwork was laid for a truly national language, although it would take decades more for fluency to become near universal. At this point, the estimated spending, about 10 to 20 billion USD. And between the 60s and 70s, the government got serious. Because while the communist government's attempts to make the country speak a unified language increased literacy rates, there was actually a lot of controversy. And this where, in hindsight, I think there was a better approach they could have used than what they did, but I'll share that in the end. Because this wasn't really just about teaching people to read. It was about promoting the new standard language as the language of communication. They wanted everyone to speak Mandarin and stop speaking their local dialects. This sparked major resentment. People felt their culture was being wiped out. They didn't like having the local dialect put down and being forced to speak something else. To be real with you, I went to French school growing up, and I remember in class, everyone would speak English and no one learned French until they said, okay, no one can speak English in class or you have to sit outside, right? And then at that point, everyone's like, okay, I gotta speak French in class. And everyone actually learned French. And so they believed that was the only way to learn the language. And I think for the most part, I mean, that is, at that time, the only way to learn the language. There's newer ways now, but we'll get into that later. But yes, unfortunately, it marked the slow death of all of China's languages. But in the government's eyes, there was no other way to encourage people to speak the new common language. Without discouraging the use of their local language, people would just stick to their local language. Without pressure, no one would switch. Even in Taiwan, the Republic of China government, who originally, tried to implement Guoyu in mainland China, well, they were focused on getting Guoyu implemented into Taiwan. And so when they got there, they did the exact same thing. They called other language inferior dialects, they made television and radio broadcasts in Mandarin, and they would meet a very similar resistance to what the mainland government faced. And so these Putonghua promotion campaigns were the fundamental turning point, but we'll get into that a bit later. Because during the 1960s came one of China's darker periods. In 1966, the Culture Revolution began, which is one of the most controversial times in China's history. During this time, formal education systems largely collapsed. Schools closed for years and intellectuals were persecuted. The nation was thrown into chaos. Now, this whole era of history is a video on its own. This is a video about language. But here's the interesting thing. With schools being closed, you'd expect the language campaign to stall, right? Wrong, actually. Mandarin actually spread faster than ever. And this was when the effectiveness of a common language started becoming more clear. See, young Red Guards from all over China only spoke Mandarin when they met. To give you some context, basically during this time, young Red Guards, or basically youth from all over China, went around to different parts, and when they met other young Red Guards from other provinces, what did they speak? They spoke Mandarin, which is very interesting because 20 years prior, they wouldn't have been able to communicate at all. But because these young people now spoke Mandarin, they could communicate. On top of that, minority languages and dialects were suppressed during this time, and so naturally, as a result, Mandarin spread even more. But the government's official spending on language education at this time, almost nothing. The spread happened because of upheaval, not budget. So ironically, spending on the language experiment here was the lowest in the whole experiment. Now, between the 70s to 80s, after the Cultural Revolution, China's education system was rebuilt. The college entrance exam was restored in 77, and schools reopened across the country. With this normalization, Putonghua, or Mandarin, promotion surged anew. Teacher colleges and schools put fresh emphasis on standard speech. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping approved the creation of radio and TV universities, a distance education system that used broadcasting to teach millions of workers and peasants. These radio TV courses delivered in Mandarin not only spread knowledge but also exposed far-flung populations to Standard Chinese, or specifically Mandarin. And so by the end of the 70s, Mandarin was again gaining ground in daily life after the disruptive Cultural Revolution years. Ironically, Deng Xiaoping, the new leader, also didn't speak the best Mandarin, but that didn't matter, right? What mattered was that the next generation did. And so by 1980, literacy passed 70%. Keep in mind, Chinese is the hardest language in the world. Most Chinese Americans can't even read Chinese, so it passing 70% is really impressive. At that time, Mandarin was considered the national lingua franca, but fluency outside of the north of China was still kind of low. During this time, estimated spending about 10 to 15 billion USD. Then the 80s and 90s came, and the 80s was the era of one country, one common language. It was the era of we're getting close, let's get the job done. In the 80s, Mandarin was enshrined in the Constitution. This affirmed that popularizing standard spoken and written Chinese was a fundamental state policy, putting linguistic unity on par with other national goals. And with it, it became required for students to have 9 years of compulsory education, all taught in Mandarin. University education in Mandarin greatly accelerated literacy and language spread. Indeed, by 1986, the law made it clear that every child should be schooled in standard Chinese, which would in time make Putonghua virtually universal among the younger generations. The biggest move, though, was the explosion of mass media in the 80s. TV and radio stations switched to broadcasting exclusively in Putonghua, and this allowed a villager in Sichuan or Guangdong to hear Putonghua nightly on the news. And this greatly improved comprehension, and by 84, surveys showed that thanks to media and schooling, 90% of China's population could understand Putonghua, though only about 50% could speak it, especially outside northern China. Again, I think this could have been accelerated with an alternate approach that I'll share in a bit. But despite that, China had laid the framework for what was going to be the 90s push to make Mandarin truly dominate the final stage of the language experiment. At this point, estimated spending 100 billion USD. Because in the early 90s, China launched its first nationwide Putonghua promotion campaign targeting the general public. In 92, not that far ago, the Ministry of Education rolled out a program that strongly encouraged the use of Putonghua in classrooms across the country. Schools that had still been teaching in local dialects, especially in the southern provinces like Canton, were urged to switch to Mandarin for instruction. The State Language Commission in 1990 had already identified Guangdong, Fujian, Shanghai, and other southern regions as key focus areas. And by the late 90s, Guangzhou unfortunately phased out Cantonese teaching. And this is where it gets unfortunate, right? Because I'm a Cantonese person, but like I said, it's not like this was just a recent thing. This has always been a goal of China to have a national language. And in the process of getting a national language, someone's gotta take the L. There's no win without loss. And so to the government, this was a loss that was worth taking because it united the people. Now the 90s also popularized pro-Mandarin slogans. One popular slogan painted out of school was 说普通话, 写规范字, speak Putonghua, write standard characters. There were a ton of these kind of promotional things scattered all across the country that reminded citizens that using the common language was a mark of civility and modern citizenship. Some campaigns even went as far as to say, don't speak dialects, be a qualified citizen, which drew a lot of criticism for, obvious reasons, right? But overall, by the year 2000, the idea that Mandarin is the prestige language of opportunity and dialects are for home use had taken hold in pretty much all of Chinese society. On top of that, Mandarin proficiency became mandatory for teachers and broadcasters, as well as those in public-facing roles. The government required passing of Putonghua proficiency exams, and the principle was that those in public-facing roles must use proper Mandarin to set an example. And ultimately, this professionalization of Putonghua, which we're starting to see more and more in Hong Kong, was a key step towards full normalization. And as a result, by 2000, literacy topped 90%, and roughly 70% of the population spoke Mandarin. This means a solid majority of China's 1.25 billion people entered the 21st century able to communicate in the same tongue, which, no matter what side you're on, is a crazy transformation from a century earlier when only a tiny elite spoke Mandarin as the lingua franca. At this point, the estimated spending was around 100 billion US dollars. And from then on, it was just do more of the same, do what works, right? The 2000s, 2010s, Mandarin took over TV, radio, and internet. For the past 20 years, we've seen. In 2014, the National Radio and Television Administration issued multiple directives limiting dialect use in media. I remember growing up, seeing my parents watch Cantonese shows, and now all I see is them watching Mandarin ones. Especially interesting when you watch those ancient Chinese TV shows, because I actually break down how Cantonese is one of the closest Chinese languages to ancient Chinese in this video here. And I grew up with those shows in Cantonese, but now they're all in Mandarin. The government dumped hundreds of billions into education and language infrastructure, and they ensured that people understood that China's language is Mandarin and that everything else is just a dialect. And that's why I'm so insistent on a language being Mandarin, Chinese is Mandarin, everything else is just 方言, dialect. In reality, there's really not that much of a difference between a language and a dialect, but it was important for the promotion of Mandarin and to establish a sort of language hierarchy that everyone understood that China has one language and people in China speak one language, Mandarin. Everything else is merely, in their eyes, a dialect. Spending in this time period estimated between 500 to 800 billion USD. And ultimately, they succeeded. By 2020, over 80% of China's 1.4 billion people spoke Mandarin. Literacy hit 97%, one of the highest for a developing country. And they're still not done. But the remaining illiterate, or people who can't speak Mandarin now, are almost exclusively elderly people in rural or minority areas, or those who grew up in special regions of China like Macau. Their goal by 2035 is that virtually the entire country can speak the language. At this point, estimate spending $1 trillion. I mean, it worked on me. I became convinced I have to learn Mandarin, right? And I'm glad I did, because it brought me a lot of opportunities. It brought me a lot more connection to my Chinese culture and heritage, and it made me so many more connections and relationships. But here's the twist. See, China's language experiment was definitely worth the north of trillions in investment. China's thriving, its growth in business technology, and so many facets can be directly attributed to literacy and overcoming the language barrier. I mean, just think about it. A business person in Beijing can communicate with someone in Shenzhen. That would have been impossible just 100 years ago. So back to the question earlier, right? Was it worth it? 100%. The ROI is definitely there. I don't think that anyone can look at that from a leadership management perspective and say that they made the wrong choice. I can't even do that because it just makes sense. Like, imagine you treat a company as a business or like a team. How the hell is a team going to operate when everyone speaks a different language? It can't. And so the ROI is undoubtedly there. And so it was definitely worth it. But there was one more cost beyond financials that's the hot topic of debate now. Because this massive success came with a price. Many regional dialects and minority languages began dying. In Guangdong, Cantonese activists fight to keep their language alive. In Shanghai, a long-running Shanghainese talk show was ordered to switch to Mandarin by 2010 if it wanted to stay on national TV. A quick look through China's list of endangered languages shows that many of them are between definitely endangered to critically endangered. And I see a lot of people saying how evil it is that they put their other dialects down, discouraged its use, but it's hard to say. I mean, one could view it as a necessary evil. Because what's harder? Forcing everyone to speak a common language so the country can grow and people can be lifted out of illiteracy, or staying the same as China has been for the past 5,000 years? It's hard. I don't know if there's a world where you could have had both. Maybe there would have been if you could start fresh. We know kids can acquire languages faster, but then all the aging population wouldn't have been able to help grow China as fast socially and economically. It probably would have taken China another 100 years to get to where it is now. And so each decision has a serious consequence. And so I look at things objectively and I think, oh, you know, it's good for the country. But at the same time, on my most recent trip to Macau and Hong Kong, I saw kids there unable to speak Cantonese and speaking only in Mandarin to each other. And I got emotional and upset because of it. But at the same time, it's just the way it's gotta be. But see, that's where it's wrong. It doesn't have to be that way because we're in a different era now. We're not in the same era of that time where resources were a lot lower. See, there's a common misconception, which is that the government wants to kill all dialects. The government doesn't want to kill all dialects, okay? They just want everyone to be able to speak Mandarin. The official stance was that dialects are cultural treasures, but promoting 普通话 takes priority for national unity. But we know that's really a polite way of saying these dialects are probably going to die because we're not promoting them or teaching them. But, you know, we'll remember them in history. But I think this assumes one thing, which is that fluency in both languages cannot be done. When in reality, today at least, Mandarin could easily be taught alongside the existing dialect in the region. See, at that time, the government implemented a one-size-fits-all approach. There was only one standard way to teach Mandarin that was implemented for all of China. Sure, the educators were different and may have spoken, you know, the local dialect, but they still all used the same kind of method. But the thing is, Mandarin isn't an alien language from the existing dialects. In fact, it's a very similar language, and if instead of being taught Mandarin from scratch, they instead focused on showing people how to map their dialect over to Mandarin, then you could easily teach Mandarin while also preserving the existing dialect. Here's an example, and this is what we do with our students in the Cantonese and Mandarin Blueprint, who on average come in illiterate in Chinese and can only speak mediocre Cantonese. We show them, for example, hey, all of your Cantonese gay sounds become Mandarin ji sounds almost every single time. So for example, 手機, 手機, 基本, 基本, 技術, 技術. Your Cantonese tone ones, for example, become Mandarin tone ones about 90% of the time, and they're pronounced the same way. And so we show them that going from Cantonese to Mandarin isn't necessarily learning a new language, but rather more like the equivalent of going from British English to American English. 我係一個律師, when going from Cantonese to Mandarin, change all of your 係 for is am to be with 是, and then just pronounce it now with a Mandarin accent, like we showed you how to map over. So 我是一个律師, easy. And our students then are able to learn Mandarin and also improve their Cantonese as a result. And on top of that, when they learn this way, they also learn much faster than basic methods that teach a language from scratch, as if they're people with no Chinese background. By the way, if you're a Cantonese speaker who wants to learn Mandarin and improve your Cantonese, you can actually grab our free guide to do that. Link down below. It shows you more about what I just talked about. But anyway, the past is the past, and actually the Chinese government is actually trying to put more into saving these dialects now, because they recognize, these are an important part of culture. And so I think that what they could do to help do that is actually maybe spend a little more money and research about how to make a unique curriculum for Shanghainese, for Taishanese, for Cantonese, for Fujianese that can help people learn both dialects at the same time. You can show people how to map from their dialect over to Mandarin rather than teaching Mandarin as like an entirely new language. I think by doing so, we can do a lot better with preservation of the existing language while also encouraging and teaching Mandarin. Because I think Mandarin is so important, but I also believe that preservation of the other dialects and languages is also so important. But just imagine how beautiful that'd be. People speak the common national language, but they also speak their local language, the language of their people, the language that has so much history behind it. But again, that's my opinion. I'm not in politics for a reason. Maybe there's more to it than what I just said. And I also consider, I still think that going from a country that had 20% literacy with over 100 languages to over now almost everyone being able to speak one common language and near universal literacy is an absolutely amazing feat. But my question for you guys is, do you feel it's worth the cost? You guys tell me. Thanks for watching today's video. Click here if you're a Cantonese speaker who wants to learn Mandarin, and click here for a video that YouTube thinks you'll love. Until next time, 再见.